So my topic will be touching, I would say, everybody in the lab, because this is something which you all are up against. You're all up against your workflow, your efficiency, and you really have to look into your outcomes. And as you can see here, outcomes are really varying widely between different clinics, between different countries. What I think pointed me very much to look into that very deep was the year 2003. It was a very special year in Germany because insurance policies changed. And all of a sudden, patients didn't get the full reimbursement. That means in 2003, every lab in Germany was doing double as much cycles as the year before. Most of the labs were not prepared for that. Luckily, in our lab, we had bought new incubators, we had new stuff. Everything went well, and even I was 6 weeks out of the lab because I was having a sickness. So it was quite fascinating for me to realize that this year was the best year ever up to that time in terms of success rates in our lab. So it tempted me really to look into this. What did we do and why did we do that? So if we look on quality and workflow, I think it's very important that we look on these essential steps, which I'm giving you point by point. And it starts actually with how you plan and install an IVLF lab, how you put in your equipment, what kind of equipment you use, how you actually do your procedures from basic to advanced. But it's also important that you look on the training, education of your embryologists, and quality control and management. We will go step by step through this and touch each individual point of lab. I'm visiting a lot of labs every year, and I'm sometimes very much puzzled to see how people run around crisscross in labs, because at the time when we designed this lab, they maybe did set it up for 300, 500, 1,000 cycles. And after 2 or 3 years, they are up at 2,000, 3,000, 5,000 cycles, especially in countries like China. And all of a sudden, your lab design doesn't fit. So you really have to be very concise about how you do a lab. You must look on functional areas, that they are properly aligned, but you really have a proper design which avoids that you get any clashes. And that can be done during the initial step already at the planning stage. Extremely important, and most people, I think, overlook that. If you go further, some people are not aware that before you start an IVF lab, you have a kind of burn-in period. You must make sure that your equipment is properly running. You shouldn't get the incubator on the day before you start actually with your IVF practice. You have to burn it in. You must make sure that humidity, temperature, everything in the lab is up to where you want to have it. And you also should look on these requirements like air quality, volatile organic compounds, but also that you look a little bit on colony-forming units so that you really make sure your lab is up and running. In some countries, this is mandatory, but not in every country. So I think that's really an important point to talk about it. Equipment. Functional equipment, I think nowadays is absolutely important. When I come into a laboratory where we use equipment which has been built some 20, 30 years back, I said, nice, like a museum, but you should maybe go with time and you should maybe update your equipment, because it's not only that these companies always want to produce new things, there is new things which have a certain function. Functionality is changing, ergonomic layout is changing, and I think that is something we really looked up in the last couple of years. Space saving, I think one of the most important features nowadays where we have to pay high rents. Christina will talk about that in London, where you have incredible prices. But we also have to think about, when we plan that, how can we expand our workload when it expands, how we can expand our equipment. Does it fit to the existing equipment? Do we change products or whatever? So it's something we really can please the embryologist by not having 5 different micromanipulation units in your laboratory, but simply always using the same, and think about that. I think I have a few examples here. One example which I really like, that was a very huge clinic, and this clinic had 2 benchtop, they had 50 benchtop incubators, and they had 2 big box incubators. One of these incubators they exclusively used for pickup, the other one exclusively for transfer. All the dishes from all patients on that day in use were in this incubator number 1 or number 2. And you can see that this is a busy program because they did quite a lot of cycles. And the incubator number 1 during pickup period was opened for 2 hours constantly. Imagine the pH in the dishes. The last patient was very bad. I mean, they placed it in the benchtop immediately afterwards, but that doesn't help. It's the same with the transfers. I guess the last couple of 2-3 patients getting a transfer, The embryos were most probably placed in dishes which were not good. So these are things to consider simply, and I guess not everybody is sometimes aware about that. But it's another laboratory, quite intriguing. Look on this incubator and how many patients are in there. They have this lot of nice bench tops. I have to say that above here, there is a climate outlet, so cold air coming down. So there's a lot of things where you really have to look on how can you avoid things going wrong. And sometimes it's really these minute details nobody looked at, like air condition and where's the outlet. When we look on that, I think I just give this example shortly because Christina will touch very much on this topic in her talk. But that is for me one example of functionality where we have, I'd say, a lot of features put together, space saving, more functionality, making things easier, having a lot of patients within a very short area. And if you look on other systems, this is just a comparison on how many patients you can incubate on what kind of square meters in your laboratory bench. So it makes really a difference sometimes. And if you want to have space saving, you have to look into proper equipment, I think. Automation, that's something some of you most probably have been the talk from Laura Rienz in the morning. She talked about automatization. That is another way of automatization. Witnessing, matching, photo-proof, that we actually go into workflow features where we use barcodes, where we actually can track. And these barcodes nowadays are linked to EMR systems. So you actually can have a very, very nice workflow where you completely avoid, you can completely go paperless. You avoid writing stuff, and you can, by this, of course, increase your safety, reduce your mix-up potential. And Christina will talk about that again. I think one of the big challenges we are facing is the changes we are seeing in our daily IVF routine over the last couple of 20, 30 years. There are some people around here, like Hubert and some others, who started doing IVF at times when IVF looked like that. It looked very simple, very, very, very simplistic, because there were only oocyte sperm, you put them together by IVF, and somehow you make a transfer on day 2 or day 3. And we know that this has changed. Because of the laboratory, we are always innovative. We are introducing a lot of laboratory technologies, which will actually take up more workload, more time, more equipment. And if you compare that, and there's no need that you read that in detail, it simply should show you that this is the level where we are today. And today is not the end. In a couple of years, this graph will look even more complex. So I guess that's something where we have to consider in the lab. How do we cope with that? How do we look on the future, and how do we go forward in order to have a good workflow and efficiency? Now, if people are stressed and have more procedures, they start to tend to make things faster. That is one thing which I saw in the laboratory. Look on that. I mean, they do a lot of dishes at the same time, doing all these nice droplets. I agree, it goes extremely fast, but you can be very much sure that by the time you fill this dish here with oil, osmolality is not as it should be, and probably you are compromising your patient. And that's funny. You can see that all over places, and simply showing that efficient is not always the way that goes hand in hand with quality. So we have to really balance that and be aware about all these problems. An example is vitrification. Hubert will talk tremendously about that and go deeper in details with you. But what I see sometimes, I come to labs where people violate protocols because they have so many blastocysts to vitrify, and all of a sudden, if they are in a solution where they should stay for 10 minutes, they cut it down to 2 minutes. That works if you have a proper protocol, like Hubert will show you, but if you don't have that, you are actually violating your protocol. You are actually violating the potential of that specific patient to later on have pregnancy and a live birth. So a flip side of increased complexity was very nicely pointed out by this paper here from Mina Alakhani. It's quite interesting, I can tell you, that each of us actually has a reference to this publication, because it seems to be really a kind of landmark when we talk about these topics. And what Mina and her co-authors did, they actually looked on the increased complexity in terms of what is the traditional approach, how we did IVF, what is the approach we do now, and what is the approach if you add on more complex technologies like PGS. And all of a sudden, you can see that the time which you spend for one patient, for one cycle, is more than doubling. That is something, I guess, which is not taken into account by everybody. In the laboratory, most probably yes, maybe not by those people who hire staff. So we have to take that into account. And that's about human resources. And human resources in the laboratory is quite a challenging situation. I guess a lot of you are facing the situation that nowadays you try to get staff and you don't get qualified staff. So there are initiatives like Azure, but also like education schemes from Vitrolife and others, where we actually try to get the people to a certain level. And if you look on the calculations here, which are how many embryologists do you need for a certain given number of cycles, if I would ask you who is in this range, not everybody would be in this range. I think most of us are having less staff than we really serve or need. It's, of course, partly due to some legal situations, like the first column is from Germany, where we obviously have less certain technologies than our countries, especially like United States. But that just gives you a little bit an overview where we are, and that these human resources is not exactly what we normally can fulfill in our lab. Staff in the laboratory for me is the most important thing, because we have to educate the people, we have to train them, we have to make sure that whatever we do in the lab is working in a good way, whether I'm in the lab or David is in the lab or Hubert is in the lab or somebody else is in the lab. Everybody should perform more or less equal. Actually, Alpha has taken that up, and Alpha has actually written recommendations for that. And these recommendations, it's a consent from a consent meeting, will come up in one of the coming issues from RBM Online. And what they have defined is actually the different levels of staff, which is quite nice. But you must establish in your IVF laboratory a way that you can get the people from this level up. And that is where we have all these things which you need to learn, where you should have certain procedures in place to give it to everybody. What I think is most important is dedication. If you have an embryologist, he can be as skilled as he would be. If he's not dedicated to what he's doing, okay, he's no long chance in my lab, at least, I would say. Quality assurance, I think, is really something which we have to guarantee by training and education. There are a lot of things out there, continuous learning, going to conferences like this here, going to homepages, going to e-learning platforms. There is a lot out there, but offer this to everybody, make it available to everybody in the laboratory. That somehow will pay off in your efficiency in the lab. Quality control and quality management, I think that's one of the key issues. Most of you have heard about standard operation procedures. Most probably not everybody has them in place, and most probably not for everything. We may have it in place for some of our procedures, but it goes above what we do in our daily routine in the lab. It's not only on the procedures we do, we also have to talk about interactions, for example, within a clinic, interactions with patients, interactions with clinicians. We need to take that into account, and it's completely indispensable if you want to control that. And we should also have SOPs for troubleshooting. Again, nothing to read that. It only should give you the different topics we talk about. And I see that people have wonderful SOPs about how to do an ICSI, but they have no idea sometimes what to do if something goes wrong. So the troubleshooting SOP is probably even more important than some of the other things which we have in our labs. How do you do troubleshooting? Yeah. There are some things which you need to take into account, and these are key performance indicators. And again, this is something which has been taken up by several publications. Alpha has also published that, especially those about cryopreservation, which I really like very much, and that has been already published. There are procedure-related KPIs. A lot of laboratories have that. But you also should look on your physical KPIs. And I guess this is getting nowadays even more important, that you know about interaction between CO2, pH, what does your temperature do if it's wrong, what does it do to the gametes, what does it do to the embryos. So you really need to take that into account and have that. That is a very nice paper which just came out recently, and as far as I know, there is at least a poster here on the same topic at the Azure. What you can see is that they have defined certain scores for putting together KPIs, and you can nicely see that there is a correlation between KPI scores and your outcome at the end. And interestingly enough, you can see here that KPIs are now no longer only in the laboratory. It's also about clinical work. And that's, I think, is very nice, because you have to also get the clinician into the boat if it comes to KPIs. It's very important about stimulation transfer, and for that also we need to have KPIs. Not only the lab if something goes wrong. Summarizing that, I think quality control today is absolutely indispensable in our world of IVF, in our daily routine work in the lab. A proper workflow is needed. It's independent of cycle numbers, but I don't know how many of you have been visiting labs in China where a laboratory doing 2,000 cycles is a small laboratories. Big laboratories are doing 5,000, 10,000, 20,000 cycles. And there you need completely different workflow, completely different attitudes, completely different views on how do you actually cope with increasing numbers of cycles. So it's absolutely important that we keep the workflow and quality control in view. And especially in these countries, I think human resources are scarce. So we have to look that we get enough human resources. It's a key to success. And finally, I think never forget that IVF is not only the lab. It's a kind of a very holistic view. And this holistic view should be taken into account if we want to look on efficiency, on the outcome. And that's what our patients actually deserve. And that's what we promise them. With that, I'd like to thank you.